Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us in another one of our Safer at Home series talks. As Falmouth once again has survived another road race, and we got to do it in person this year. So it's we're trying to get somewhat back to normalcy. So glad to have you with us tonight. Couple things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all books that are on our series are available at a Cousins bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you will participate and join the local economy. Our speaker tonight, Julian Rubinstein, is a visiting professor over at Denver University. He's also an award-winning journalist, author, and producer. This is not his first book, but he moved back to Denver for this one. And as I said to him, I'm going to ask him, and maybe he's going to answer it right out of the chute. As somebody who grew up in suburban Chicago, I'm used to hearing stories about gang violence, but I never would have associated it with Denver. So would you welcome our speaker tonight, Julian Rubinstein?
Thank you, Mark. And first of all, it's great to be with everyone out in Cape Cod or wherever you may be. I am outside of Denver, just getting a little bit more summertime in, but indeed this story took me back to the town where I'd grown up in Denver, Colorado. I have a little sort of slide presentation here that can kind of introduce the book a little bit. I should say this is the book, The Holly, 5 Bullets, 1 Gun, and the Struggle to Save an American Neighborhood. It came to my attention in 2013 when the main character in the story had shot someone at his own peace rally. He was a former gang leader who'd become a well-known anti-gang activist and was actually so successful that he was working at that time under a federal anti-gang grant to do the work on the ground in Northeast Denver, where in fact gang violence has been a problem since the late 80s. And when I started getting into all this and thinking about that I'd been a journalist for my whole career and I'd never done a story in my hometown. I was living in Brooklyn and done stories all over the world, and done a first book that's called Ballad of the Whiskey Robber. It's a story of a guy who was became a folk hero by robbing banks in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, and it sort of tells this large story of those times. And I thought to myself that, yeah, if this were a story that I'd read about in maybe LA, or I wouldn't have thought as hard about it, but there were a number of factors that made me want to know more about what had happened, which included that Terence Roberts, who's here, the main character in the book, was part of a high-profile redevelopment of the neighborhood that he'd grown up in. His grandmother, Ernestine Boyd, had moved there moved to Denver in 1955 and became one of the first African Americans to live in the neighborhood in 1960. He was third generation, and there was a high-profile redevelopment going on there. He was the sort of community rep, and it just seemed anyway that obviously something had gone terribly wrong, but what was it? And I soon sort of realized that this was more than just a sort of a question of a whodunit type mystery. It was like a why done it. We knew who pulled the trigger, but what had happened? And ultimately, what I did to do, for those of you who've read the book, obviously know, is it became, I had to go back generations to actually understand what happened on the day of this shooting and in this neighborhood. And it took me back to the time when Ernestine, who had fled from an Arkansas cotton plantation in 1955. And it was part of the second great wave of migration, and Denver became one of the smaller, places that got a lot of African-American population, but some developed then, and there was some other small population before that. And but it kept growing. And ultimately, I mean, at the time that Ernestine moved to Denver, this was the Holly Square, which is the shopping center and the kind of center of the neighborhood that the entire book is named for. This is Ernestine back at the time, and it started out as an almost entirely white neighborhood. Well, it was 99% white in 1960, and by 1970 it was almost entirely Black. And of course, during that time, the civil rights movement was beginning, and sure enough, in Denver, and you know, the threats that the protest leaders at the time faced, which is very, to me, became part of the important sort of cycle of this story. Is in many ways, this story unexpectedly to me became a story of activism over the years and thwarted activism. And sure enough, in this neighborhood, there was a lot of serious activism that was going on among the African-American residents. They were concerned actually about what was happening in the police activity that was going on in their neighborhood. And then one night, a young man, Nathan Jones, was shot by police right in the Holly Square, which is sort of this sort of tragic window into this community over decades. The shooting between Terence and this younger gang member in this peace rally in 2013 also happened right there. And in any case, this crime in 1968 became this sort of centerpiece and the main jumping off point in Denver's civil rights movement. It led to protests, demands, and a lot of actions and activity, including by Denver's Black Panthers. And this is Lauren Watson, the leader of Denver's Black Panthers in that's in 68, yeah. And so what happened was activism that came out of all this, and that was going on, of course, around the country. And another unexpected sort of connection to the story was the appearance, or the involvement of activists in the civil rights movement and in the Black Power movement who had previously been gang members. And that includes Bunchy Carter, for example, shown here, became the co-leader of LA, the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panthers. And sure enough, Bunchy was among many who, you know, his gang activity was not what ultimately led him to a young death, but the fact that the FBI had fomented a conflict between the LA Black Panthers and another group that led to his being shot and killed on the UCLA campus in 1969. And so, you know, through this, of course, at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, being at the FBI, was through the office of the United States and through the powers and legal surveillance activities of the government, were able to, of course, infiltrate and ultimately destabilize and take down so many of the activists that were working at the time and also were role models at the time. You know, that sort of the void that was left when so many youngsters in the 70s and 80s had in African-American neighborhoods where, you know, social services programs were not working. And Denver was absolutely, the story of Denver's, you know, development is told through the book. And it was the case that the two historic Black neighborhoods in Denver ultimately were targets of major law enforcement efforts, and also led ultimately to, they were the first two neighborhoods in Denver that the Crips and Bloods from Los Angeles arrived in the mid 1980s. And so Denver actually had become, at the time, a very interesting part of the what law enforcement was trying to study and dismantle, which was the rise of street gangs, and certainly the huge explosion of that movement out of Los Angeles with the Crips and Bloods. And Denver was the first city off of the coast that these gangs were seen. And the Crips and the Bloods in Denver were formed in the two most historic African-American neighborhoods, 5 Points and Northeast Park Hill. This story takes place mostly in Northeast Park Hill. And sure enough, these two neighborhoods that had been, of course, closely aligned and had similar goals at one point, then were ultimately found in a place where they were turning their arms against each other. I look at that, of course, in the book, and questions of what led to that. There's a number of things that were going on. I mean, the story is very much told through the eyes and the voices and the characters of Terence's family, as well as many other major figures in Denver that were both in the news and sort of the invisible figures of Denver that were not in the news, that were larger than life in their neighborhoods. But ultimately, the Crips and Bloods were, of course, it just as in Denver as elsewhere, were a major part of law enforcement efforts, both federal and city and state wide. And among the early people to join the Bloods in Denver was Terence Roberts. He was 15. He had been an honor roll student, and he saw it as protecting his neighborhood, as basically just a movement that had swept the neighborhood completely. Hundreds of kids who were joining for camaraderie, for protection, and they saw that what they were doing in this, I mean, it was a twisted way to think of their own activism in terms of protecting their neighborhood, but that's what they saw themselves as doing. And of course, ultimately, it led to a lot of deaths, a lot of just heart-wrenching things, and including, for Terence, he managed to stay alive, but out in prison for most of 10 years. During this time, of course, law enforcement efforts continued, and one of the horrors that had happened was that the Holly Shopping Center, in another major tragedy, was burned to the ground in 2008 by members of the Crips in retaliation for a murder. And this happened right as Terence had been finally gotten out of prison and himself wanted to become an activist and an anti-gang activist, and absolutely determined to make something of his life. And it was the fire in 2008 that sort of really vaulted him into the idea of not only doing anti-gang work, but trying to combine it with activism that was part of not only the neighborhood's history, also what it needed, and also that he wanted to do it independently. That was his big mission. A lot of people in these neighborhoods, unfortunately, have a very low tolerance or degree of trust for law enforcement. And Terence absolutely was determined to do like a street movement, which he had started called the Colorado Camo Movement. And it had a remarkable level of success, uniting Crips and Bloods, and brought Denver's gang violence to an all-time low. And he was being praised by anti-gang activists around the country, as well as in Denver, although he ran into, some powerful forces, both in the development of Holly Square as well as in law enforcement, which he became at odds with in terms of how to run this anti-gang effort that he wanted to run. Well, especially when toward the end of, in the couple years before the shooting, he ultimately, against probably his better judgment, and he hadn't before taken law enforcement money, but there's the most amount of funding for anti-gang efforts comes from law enforcement. And Terence, it actually was hard for him to raise money that he needed. And this is a photo of his outreach workers about a year before the shooting. And what happened was that they felt increasingly that they were being pressed for information about people in the neighborhood, and they did not feel like they were being able to do the work that they felt was they were most suited for, which was more prevention work as opposed to intervention or what they saw as efforts that should be law enforcement oriented. And Terence was also coming at odds with developers of the New Holly who were not from the neighborhood, white, and I can talk about that, actually, how it was for me doing this story. But he basically found himself in the center of some discord in the neighborhood, and falling into disfavor with the forces that were around him. And suddenly, on the day he's supposed to move into a new Boys and Girls Club that he had campaigned for, he instead ended up in jail that night, charged with attempted murder for shooting a young gang member who ended up paralyzed but lived. And it was that point at which I came across this story and started to get interested in it. So it basically, some of those reasons in the backdrop of this story are the reasons that made me particularly interested in looking at this sort of larger context in which this had taken place. And so what happened after I got to Denver, here I can turn I'll just leave it like this for now, was that the gang war had exploded in the wake of this event that had really torn up the community. Terence had a lot of supporters and a lot of high profile and powerful detractors at a very sensitive time in the neighborhood, with a lot of things riding on the redevelopment as well as the anti-gang effort, which was part of this Department of Justice Project Safe Neighborhoods grant, which is it was millions of dollars, and something that a lot of agencies were involved in. So interestingly, when I got there, I did find that it was pretty clear that there was an effort to sweep this incident under the rug. There was the media reporting was immediately along the lines of things that didn't add up to what I was seeing. It had quoted various people regarding Terence that I would later find out were gang members. One of the main ones was part of I discovered was part of an actual effort to attack Terence on the day in question. And he faced these charges. Law enforcement people were aware of what had actually happened. There were a lot of people in the neighborhood who felt that there was already evidence and that law enforcement was actually aware of what happened before it was going to happen. But there was a lot of discussion about informants, about who was working for the police. That took a long time to sort through, and also things that played out in front of me. And as the new anti-gang effort started, it was taken over by another, actually I have a photo of him up here, the guy on the left with talking to the two cops, Reverend Leon Kelly, sort of the opposite sort of approach to this gang violence and intervention. He'd been doing it since the 80s when it started. He was, when I would be with him in the car, he would ask if we should call Michael, referring to the mayor who he had on speed dial. He knew every power broker in town. His board of directors included the former Denver head of the FBI, the Denver police chief. And he took over the grant and sure enough moved into Terence's office with 4 outreach workers who were all active gang members. They were all people I knew and had met. And there were a lot of people convinced that they were working for the police. And then sure enough, a couple weeks go by and one of them is actually busted with a bunch of drugs and admits in the paperwork I got that he was working for the commander who's there on the other side on the far right. Basically, and that person was also one of the people that a witness told me had told these younger guys to jump Terence on the day in question. So it was, I mean, this is just a sort of one part of my reporting, because a lot of this reporting was, it veered everything from, classic like shoe leather reporting like that, of just talking to people, but of course also a lot of digging papers and requesting papers, going through court documents. And ultimately, I guess I won't talk exactly about all of the levels of things that I found on that day, but the third act sort of is a little more sort of current day and going through the investigation as I went through it, and being, and being a white person in some of the stuff I dealt with, which actually was for the most part a high level of trust. The media has unfortunately not performed very well in these neighborhoods in Denver and don't have a very good reputation, but I guess I was seen partly as not the local media, and also I was people were recognizing that I was showing up and began texting me when there were shootings, so that as if they wanted to not only make sure I knew, but that they knew I might be able to do something about it. And ultimately, like a really extraordinary sequence of events played out in front of me. This is a trial, and there's some testifying at trial. And I guess just to say, when we got to that point, he had been charged as a habitual criminal. The sequence of events that happened also includes some, I would say, questionable tactics used by the DA's office to either try to intimidate Terence to take a deal, or really try to put him away for life for a shooting in which they knew he had been attacked. He was a guy who in Denver at the time was, regularly leading protests against law enforcement. When Trayvon Martin was killed, he was co-led that thing, and then this was leading up, and here he was working for law enforcement at odds with them. And they certainly didn't show him any leeway or leniency. And so he was facing life in prison when he went to trial, turned down offers for plea deals. And I mean, I guess since I'll sort of give a little bit of a roundup of what ended up happening after that, I won't say exactly what happened at the trial, but the trial was in 2015, and of course, it's just about a cliche that a writer misses his book deadline. But in this case, I guess it's fortunate I did, because it would have been, if I'd turned my book in like 2018 or something, when I think I was supposed to have, I would have missed the unbelievable events of 2020, in which Terence Roberts emerges on the scene in the post-George Floyd protests, leading the most active, biggest protests in Denver co-leading the Justice for Elijah McClain movement. He literally became the face of it. That's him. And leading huge marches of young protesters. And then sure enough, is actually arrested for inciting a riot and facing felony charges for his protesting. So just the cycles of, you know, what was happening with activists in African-American neighborhoods through the years, and Terence's story was just absolutely remarkable. So it definitely seemed to me just lucky that I did miss my book deadline, and the book came out a couple months ago. It's had a serious impact in Denver so far, and actually some very interesting and problematic reactions. Been lucky to do some interviews, NPR, and so forth. So it's been great to actually. I'll play one last thing. That's a small video, because it's been just really an honor to be able to spend this time on it. It was not easy. It was actually very challenging in so many ways, in ways that I didn't expect. But I think that the story is very illuminating about some very important things, especially right now. And because one of the things that I think it does is sort of show some of the hidden ways, both that violence in our communities happens, why it happens, but also why nothing is done about it. And sort of also the incredibly complicated and challenging problems we have that include this sort of almost industrial complex of nonprofits, as well as the other things that we have maybe, you know, come to understand in a way about how the criminal justice system is supporting programs that are not necessarily doing what is hoped, or accomplishing what is hoped. In Denver, they've had a huge number of a huge amount of money flow into the city from federal, from the DOJ, from the CDC, to study and fight gang violence. Some $19 million over, or $16 million, I believe, over 19 years, from 2010 to 2019, beginning when gang violence was at an all-time low in Denver, up to just over a year ago. And despite the amounts of money, the violence went up every single year. So I've also been working on a documentary film that, and this is a sort of a small trailer. It's a 1 minute little bit sort of from that, but also a trailer for the book. So I'll just show it. I think it, you know, just visualizes some of the elements I discussed, and also about activism today. So let's see if I can even go full screen on that. Well, if I can't, I will just play it.
The number of murders in the city has jumped almost 50%.
We have our babies murdering each other. We had a solution to that. Terence Roberts was that solution. Violence reduction programs the United States has seen.
For real, this was the life-saving gun.
He comes from that lineage of Mumia Abu-Jamal, Malcolm X. Terence is what the system is afraid of.
I knew he was in danger the day he started marching.
Former gang member turned anti-violence activist is in jail tonight.
I'm looking at life in prison, y'all, so I ain't got much to lose.
Terence Roberts being gone is an opportunity for a lot of people.
I am not going to be afraid of nobody, and I'm a person to kill you.
Terence has become the new model of how the system will shut down the passionate and aggressive movement for peace.
Okay. I'm stopping sharing my screen, so I don't know. Let me see how I can hopefully just see my me up there. But that's so that was sort of, you know, just some of the elements I wanted to you know, discuss or present just in this sort of, I guess, roundup or general presentation of the book. But I think you know, well, I'm happy to hear any questions or discuss anything further, what anything you might want to hear.
Thank you, Julian. I guess I'll jump to the conclusion first, or jump to the end of the book first, and I guess maybe without revealing everything from the book, because I don't want you to reveal everything in the book, but is it do you find it, does it sound like Terence Roberts was set up, that he was kind of an innocent victim, or is it more complicated than that? I mean, that you see it, you mentioned that in the clip that there are people who would benefit by him being out of the picture. Is he a pawn in a larger game, or is it not quite that simple?
Well, anytime you talk about a pawn in a larger game, then that's definitely not simple already. So that's part of, I mean, that's one way to look at it in terms of him being set up. Yeah, I think there was, you know, there's things you can prove and then things you can, you know, I mean, in the book, you know, luckily it's a story, and I'm not at trial, and I try to present, let's put it this way, I try to present both the voices of the community as well as sort of what I can say and differentiate that. I think I can prove that he was set up, and he was going to be, there was a real effort to remove him from the community that definitely involved the other gang members. Those other gang members had very close, significant ties to the police, and they also were tied to a couple of other activists who have close ties to all of the nonprofits and the developers who wanted Terence out. So I'm not saying that those people, I certainly can't say that those people were part of any setup, but I do know from my reporting that gang members on the street, at a minimum, are very aware of what people sort of up the chain all the way to elected officials or developers or nonprofit people or activists who are, you know, working with those people. They're very aware what those people are feeling or thinking. And I was amazed. I mean, more, I guess I was amazed because of the level of connections and how fast the connections could be between sort of information on the street and, you know, on the level of like gang members and things that would happen in, you know, in offices or elected officials who are otherwise would not necessarily say that they had such close connections to gang members. I mean, and so it definitely raises a lot of questions. I would say it raises a lot of questions.
What's sort of the chronology? I mean, you started at the beginning and you showed J. Edgar Hoover, for example, but what's sort of the chronology of the rise of gang violence, you know, and Bloods and Crips coming from LA into Denver to leading to essentially today? What are some of the way station points that we should know about, and why does it move, you know, west to east like that?
Well, actually, the drug trade was a big one. And I actually had a photo, I didn't show it, but so, you know, in the early 80s, crack cocaine became big in LA in gang communities. It was sold, one of the biggest sellers was this guy, Freeway Ricky Ross. He grew up in a Crips neighborhood near Hoover, near the Hoover Crip neighborhood, near the highway, near the freeway. Gave him his nickname. He never wanted to be a gang member, but he was in the neighborhood with them, and he wanted to be a businessman. And he recognized one day that he'd seen this new type of drug that was took one hit and they wanted more, and he was determined to become a big dealer, and he did. And I actually talk about it in the book, which is that there were his dealers at the time were a couple of wealthy and politically oriented Nicaraguans who were involved in the freedom fighter fighting against the communist Contras in Nicaragua, and they were flying this stuff in, and it turned out later they did end up having, and you know, it's a debatable question of how much the CIA knew and if they were involved, but they had ties to the CIA. In fact, one of these guys later became an informant and put away Ricky Ross. He became a DEA informant, and those guys stayed out of prison. They were the kingpins. But anyway, one way or another, drugs flowed into these poor communities in LA. And the way that they ended up in Denver was that at some point in the mid 80s, the city in LA the South LA in particular, was just flooded awash with this drug. So the prices were so low because it was so easy to get. And there were a lot of young Black men who went elsewhere looking for a better return on their investment. And this was at a time when, the Crips and Bloods had started in the 70s. Well, in 1970 in LA, the Crips started. And actually the Bloods were formed. I tell this story in the book too. The Bloods were formed by a group of gangs trying to protect them, who wanted to not become Crips, and they were protecting themselves against Crips. And it slowly became, over the 80s, gangs became more armed with actual, as opposed to just with fighting with their fists or sometimes knives. As guns became part of the culture, they became more violent, and they got involved in drugs. Of course, there were altercations involving drug trade, involving drug turf, and so Crips and Bloods, though, in any case, were the kind of criminal element in some of these neighborhoods. Ricky Ross formed alliances with many of them, but the gangs controlled a lot of the drug trade, and then started moving out of LA to get to expand that trade. And so that was one of the main reasons that they expanded. And then, in other neighborhoods in other cities, including Denver, were having problems that made a lot of these kids join gangs in the first place, which was, unfortunately, these were one single parent families. They were not only often without a father figure, but without maybe other good turn to each other. It was like their families. And so, these gangs caught on, and then they were powered also by this incredibly really illustrative new form of music, which was, gangster rap or hip hop. And a lot of that came out of LA, including NWA and the attitude it had toward police. And it really caught on even with white people. And in any case, that music was sort of like, in fact, mimicking in many ways the actual gangsters. The gangsters were the cool people, and ultimately, and the story is told in the book as well about Biggie and Tupac, who ultimately became rivals. Tupac was considered a Blood affiliate, Biggie was considered a Crip affiliate, and they both ended up dead in drive-by shootings, and within a year of each other. So those are, some of the points along and that was in 96 and 97. 96 was Tupac and 97 was Biggie. And so, and it just has, unfortunately, it's been one of those things as well that law enforcement has said for decades that they were going to end gang violence. But it has, I would say, and I know people who argue that actually the gang war in our own cities is the longest war. We have a nightmare right now in Afghanistan, everyone is probably aware of, and that many consider the longest war in American history. But the gang war, particularly between the Crips and Bloods, was still rages, started in the 80s, and still continues. So yeah, those are, I guess, a few points along the path.
You also mentioned too that Terence had some issues, when he was doing the anti-gang movement. He comes out of prison. He wrestles with the fact of having to take money from the police. He knows that it's lucrative, but it's problematic. That there are white supporters who want to build buildings, but they want their names on them, so it's lucrative, but it's problematic. Talk about the tug and pull that happens with race, about people that may have been well-meaning, may not have been. Maybe they're just being self-serving, but it complicates the story on Terence's point of view too. That he needs money, but some of the sources of getting that are problematic.
Yeah, this is, and I'm often asked this at events, and it's so complicated. Like, what do we do? And it's really, it's because there actually are, and I try to be really fair in the book to everyone. I do think that there are developed cities, but ultimately, I think what happens is that there's such a strong power base in a lot of places, and certainly it's the case in Denver, where you might, it's kind of like, what people sometimes say when you get into the White House and then you're suddenly, weighed down with all the special interests or whatever, and it changes everything. In a place like Denver, if you're, it's hard to not kind of become more powerful or successful, let's say successful in what you want to do, unless you widen your group of people and meet the more powerful people or wealthy or influential parts of the city, and a lot of those people end up very connected and are kind of working in some ways to either scratch each other's backs or rather ultimately kind of continue their own I guess influence on what they want to do, and by doing that, it means sort of in a lot of ways playing nice with other interests that, even if it's maybe not either in your interest or maybe not ultimately achieving what it's supposed to do. And I think, so oversight and accountability are a couple of major things, missing from this picture. But it's like, I saw, for example, in the DOJ stuff, like they had supposed oversight of this, of the efforts that were being made in Denver. But I was reading the reports, and it was clear that, you can also do your own oversight and, or make oversight seem like it's being done, and even if it's not. So I think I guess I just sort of wish there were more people that would be able to sort of look at independent efforts for funding without thinking that they have to co-opt them. And I think that is happening a lot. And, you know, with Terence, it was very hard, I think, for people to, you know, understand and sometimes even deal with him, because he was dealing with just another thing entirely. And it's actually not often something that's very, even for him, easy to explain, you know, things that can work or not work. And, you know, when the other sort of invisible force that's often, certainly in Denver, and I'm sure elsewhere, a major part of these things is that law enforcement is very strategic and has a long arm, let's say, you know, like I mean, in Denver, they were at all the meetings for the redevelopment. They were, you know, and meanwhile, they are also you know, they have often big money or big donors or allies. And even, you know, most politicians want to, you know, work with law enforcement, support them. And I'm not saying they shouldn't. But again, the goals get kind of co-opted. And so now, at a time when I think we have a lot of people questioning, you know, how law enforcement's working, some people that, in terms of, and I see now some of the questions on the board here, but, you know, in terms of some of the reaction, I would just say that, like, I was having meetings before the book came out of people saying that they knew that this book, my credibility and the book's credibility was going to be impugned, and it was like you could see it coming 100 miles away, and that's happened because people, unfortunately, I would say the unfortunate sort of part of the book in some circles is that instead of wanting to kind of look at some of the things that are clearly raised in this book and that are problematic, there's an effort to discredit me or the book, or to try to ignore it, or like the city of Denver is now being hounded by some people about whether or not active gang members are working for it. They basically won't say, but they are working for it, and it's definitely the case. And they kind of are just, I don't know, they're that's the disappointing thing is. And I guess the other thing that, in terms of what, you know, could be done or how to address these things, is like people just have to be transparent or reliably fair or open, you know, especially when public monies are, you know, on the table. And I've definitely just not found that to be the case, although I guess I've just I'm not surprised. I guess I wish it would have been different, but I'm not surprised.
Is there any particular group that's impugning you or criticizing you, and how do you deal with that? I mean, you're now living there, working there. What, you know, it's one thing if you were back in New York and writing about Denver, but how do you deal with it, and where's it coming from?
Well, so yeah, one of them is a Black activist who's very prominent, probably the most prominent Black activist in Denver, who is shown in the book to be someone who's not who he says he is. He's not even like a huge part of the book, but that is the case. And he's also connected to all of the people in the book who are highly problematic. And he's threatened my life on Facebook. He's given a virtual green light. And I'm just, I had to respond, I had to give, and he's impugning my credibility to reporters. Have been told what he's been saying. I just had to give another response about it today. And in terms of what to do, I mean, I've had to leave the city, to be honest with you, because of for safety. So you know, I've talked to law enforcement about it. It's yeah, it's no joke.
How long did you spend working on this, and where did you get all your research?
I spent about 7 years working on it. I started in February of 2014, and I finished the epilogue in February 2021. So yeah, and it was, but yeah, I moved back. I was like living in my mom's 2-bedroom apartment for most of it, or for a chunk of it, and then I moved out and got a place and very near where a lot of this was going on, actually. It was absolutely consuming is the thing. I was just telling someone the other day how, like, I mean, it was a couple of years at least after the trial or more where I kind of even came out of hiding almost. Like I was just not even, I couldn't even deal almost with anyone because of so much of what I'd seen going on and how it affected me and impacted me. I had PTSD. I mean, a lot of people died that I knew and was around. And it was just also just being around, honestly, the level of sort of anger and mistrust and even paranoia, and then also realizing so many things that I realized that were just completely, shattering things that are accepted, in the public. I mean, and doing the whole story itself, I mean, I call it an alternate history of both a shooting case and of a community. And so but at one point, there was a point for sure when I was in it, when I felt like I'm in so deep that, like, I don't know what to do, and almost that I didn't want to be there, but had to just basically figure out how to deal with the fact that there was no way out, other than out the other side of it, because I couldn't turn back. I wasn't going to turn back. It was too important and I was too far in. But it was, I definitely felt many times that I was in danger. And there's it. So yeah, it was super challenging.
I hope there's been also support for you on this one. I mean, that it hasn't been all negative. I know it's a human reaction. We tend to focus on the negative, but I mean, other people leap to your defense or been really thankful you wrote this book?
Definitely. I mean, one of the things that's a bummer about leaving Denver was, like, right before I left, I couldn't believe it, but because I didn't think people would recognize me, but I ended up in Denver. There was a lot of media, although interestingly, the Denver Post refused to cover it at all. They were the only place in Denver. There's now a lot of publications there that didn't cover it, and they really don't come off well in the book, unfortunately. That was very hard even for me to see how badly they were performing, but in the coverage of this case in the community. But I was on the cover of this magazine, or alt weekly rather, Westward, and people were coming up to me and thanking me, like, for doing this. And yeah, I've had lots. I mean, we had an amazing launch event with lots and lots of people from the community. There's a lot of people who are very, very happy that I've done this and know the risk that I've taken in order to do it. So yeah, and I haven't looked for other sympathy regarding the other stuff. I mean, I'm just sort of talking about it because I haven't talked much about it actually publicly. The stuff about my safety, I really barely talked about it publicly, but I just getting to a point where I'm like, I don't care. Like, in terms of, I was trying not to talk about it, and now I don't really mind talking about it. So I don't think they were, people weren't even probably realizing they needed to come to my safety. This whole incident and the episode that I've talked about is like one specific guy who a lot of people know is not someone who's trustworthy. So I don't think it's, I haven't really needed people to come to my defense, I don't think. So it's just something I've been almost dealing with, like, on a small level,
I guess it's an offshoot of Phil's question about reactions to Denver. What have been the ripple effects in terms of actions in Denver about this, positive or negative? You know, and certainly, obviously, we've seen what's been going on nationally with other events, but what's been the ripple effects after the publication of your book locally?
Well, it's interesting because some of it's still playing out. I think it's going to play out for a while. And if anything, well, so basically we're going to see what the city might or might not do in response to the problems that have been pointed out in the book with its anti-gang effort. You know, I mean, one issue is, of course, that, like, you know, I mean, the media, even though there's now a lot of public, you know, there's not a lot of, there's so many things that need to be covered and not a lot of things that are being well covered in Denver. But one thing that's been out there a little bit from the book, and there have been things written about this, or people taking off from the book and pushing the city to try to answer about some of these issues. And I think that's going to be interesting in terms of what is the outcome. Like, are they going to, and unfortunately, you know, so Terence himself has made, like, of course, I mean, he's in particular made powerful enemies, and one of his enemies is the 3-term mayor who's African-American, Michael Hancock. He's pretty controversial in Denver in general, and in the Black communities. You know, I haven't actually seen those numbers, but he's got his supporters and his detractors in that community, and he's someone who's gotten an F from public integrity and for his grade for transparency. He doesn't easily kind of, you know, look within, or let's take a look at this, or we need to do better, or not. He's not the kind of guy who's that's not in his vocabulary. So he's been dodging and whatever. But there are, you know, there's another friend of mine, African American, who runs a radio show. He's been trying to push them to answer to it. We'll see what happens. I mean, it's a strange age in that we're in, where there's just, I guess I just feel like if you are, you know, wanting to pull off just anything or do what you want or be corrupt or do whatever, Denver's a great place, because the chances of you getting caught, or even if you're caught, you're not gonna, what are the consequences? So, you know, on the one hand, I kind of want to see how this plays out and what'll happen. On the other hand, I guess I kind of have to remind myself that it's possibly unlikely that they're going to have to do anything. I mean, you know, although there are some law enforcement people actually who are interested in the findings, actually. So, you know, we'll see what happens. You know, I think it'll be slow. They're dealing with a lot, just as they are in a lot of places right now in terms of reform. And this is sort of one of many things that they're trying to run and hide from at the moment. But maybe it'll, you know, it'll have some impact.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time for talking about this tonight, and congratulations on completing this, and you know, keeping your sanity. And frankly, you know, I really appreciate you doing this and being as forthcoming as you've been, and continued success. I always try to tell people, you know, stay safe. It's more of a pandemic thing, but in your case, stay safe, and it's not just a pandemic thing. So, continued success with the book. And continued good luck. What's your next project? I know you're teaching at Denver, but what's
exactly? I'm kind of like, you know what? I think I'll do some teaching for a while.
Yeah, I can understand that.
But I am doing the documentary. Actually, we've been working hard on it, and so I'm excited about that. We captured incredible material, and also we're able to do it similar to the book in that, but like, I mean, it's a feature documentary, but it has like historical throwbacks, so you kind of get the story of the neighborhood, and you see some of what happened. I mean, just from the clip, perhaps even, but some of what happens in Act 3 of the book played out right in front of me on camera. So it's pretty. I think it'll be pretty interesting documentary. So I've been working on that, and yeah, and doing some teaching, and yeah, thanks everyone for having me. And it's, you know, it's both this very oh, that's interesting. Someone moved to Falmouth from Denver. I see that, Susan. Yeah, well, that's really super interesting. Yeah. So it's, you know, it's both a story that I think is very much like in the zeitgeist of what's happening today, but it's also, you know, for those of you who've read it, I think, Mark, like it's a multi-generational, character-driven story with these really unbelievable people that have just had an amazing impact on my life. And just to see what they've overcome and what they face all the time is just, I mean, it's like a Shakespearean stuff. So I was also, you know, honored. It was a lot of work and a challenge, and I was also honored to be able to do it.
All right. The name of the book is The Holly. His name is Julian Rubinstein. Thank you for taking the time tonight. Good luck. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Julian, keep teaching.
Exactly. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.